Good morning, everybody, and welcome to ITIF. My name is David Hart, and I'm a senior fellow here. And today's event is on Arpa-E, as we call it, the catalyst of energy innovation in the U.S. ITIF is a think tank here in Washington oriented towards science and technology policy issues. And one of the areas that it focuses on is clean energy innovation. Today I'm going to present a paper that I wrote with Mike Carney of MIT. Mike is not available today because he's just received a second baby. Yesterday, the baby's 24 hours old, so the baby was nice enough to let us finish the paper, which we were worried about, but not nice enough to let us do the event. So Mike sends his regrets, but I guess we're going to archive this, so I think we ought to give Mike a round of applause and say congratulations, Mike. So when you see the video, Mike, you'll know that we were thinking of you. As I mentioned, I'm a senior fellow here. I'm also a professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason, where I work on science and technology policy. Mike is a PhD student at MIT in the Sloan School there, and before that was a consultant on the National Academies study on Arpa-E, which we drew on heavily in this paper. And I want to acknowledge Paul Beaton, who's here from the Academies, and thank them for their work, which we're gratuitously recycling to some extent in this paper. We've got a terrific panel to discuss the agency and the work, so let me introduce them briefly. So I'll start with my immediate left is Drew Bond. Drew is a senior fellow and director of energy innovation at the American Council on Capital Formation. Also an entrepreneur, has a business in the renewable energy field, and was recently co-author of a paper on tax reform and energy R&D, so that's something that we might take up if we have interest in that. Next to Drew is Tom Stepien. So Tom just flew in from the Bay Area, where he's the CEO of Primus Power. Primus Power is a storage company, and it's working on a grid-scale zinc-based flow battery, and he'll talk about that, I'm sure, when he makes his remarks. And then joining us remotely by robot is Lou Schick. Can you hear us, Lou?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Great. Hi, Lou. So Lou is joining us from his office in New York. He's a partner and chief technical officer of the New World Capital Group, which is a private equity firm that specializes in clean tech and resource productivity investments. And he's got a background in engineering as well as finance. And also relevant to this panel is the fact that he was a member of the National Academies assessment of Arpa-E, and can reflect on that as well. So we've got a great lineup, a lot of varied perspectives on the agency, and we'll also look forward to hearing from you, both in the room and online. So if anybody wants to tweet a question in, you can tweet it at hashtag ITIF Clean Energy. So please do that. We should get to that portion of the program around 11 o'clock. So I'm going to present the paper. I'll give you the highlights of the paper. You're welcome to download it now off the ITIF website. Those of you in the room can also pick up a hard copy. And I'm going to cover Mike's portion of the presentation as well. Then I'm going to ask Tom, Lou, and Drew to make remarks in that order. Then we might have a little bit of crosstalk, and then we'll open it up for questions. And I also want to thank ITIF, Rob, Randolph, Lindsay, Teresa, and the staff here for their support in this work. And also BGC3, Robin Millicam here helped provide support for this paper. All right, so let me launch into it. So I like this metaphor catalyst. The U.S. has a lot of innovation resources. It's got people, it's got money, it's got ideas. But in energy, they haven't been brought together as much as they should. And a catalyst, of course, is a chemical that accelerates reactions, but it doesn't change. It's also able to be reused. So I like that metaphor for Arpa-E because I think that's what it does. It brings together a lot of resources that wouldn't otherwise have been brought together, and then it accelerates the innovation process in doing so. And that's what we need. We need clean energy innovation in this country to be accelerated. And the topic is particularly timely because the President's budget zeroed out Arpa-E, and the House of Representatives has gone along with that recommendation, and the Senate has not. And it would really be a tragedy if this young agency were to be wiped out when it's just getting started. And as you'll see, it's producing some really promising results, and it's an innovation that deserves itself to be continued. So why do we have this problem in energy innovation? I assume I'm sort of preaching to the converted here, so I won't go into this in too much depth. But it's both a combination of market failures and policy weaknesses. Why isn't there clean energy innovation stimulated by the market, or why is there not enough of it? Well, there's a famous economics paper called The Tale of Two Market Failures. The first one being the market underinvests in knowledge production, and this is true across the board, particularly knowledge production that might undermine existing business models and profit streams. And then, of course, in the energy area, we have externalities, air pollution, climate change, and other externalities that are not incorporated into the market by definition. And then on top of that, and this is an issue that we've gone into at length in other work, energy is a complex system, and it's difficult to make system change, and that is an important factor that slows down the process in the energy system. So government has stepped in to try to rectify these market failures with some success, but not perfectly. And a couple of the weaknesses that Arpa-E helps to address are mentioned here in the slide. One is that a lot of our funding of R&D tends to rely on peer review, which is great to advance the interests of scientists, but it's not necessarily great to advance the interests of particular users in society. So there's a question about how we allocate our R&D funds. And then secondly, there's this gap between knowledge that's generated by the system and its use in society. So anybody who's ever taken science policy has probably come across Don Stokes's book. He created a 2x2 matrix, which is, as we know, the ultimate form of knowledge in social science, and put himself on our conceptual map for good with this notion of one dimension here having to do with the use of knowledge, so relevance for immediate application, and the other axis here is emphasis on understanding, so understanding what's really going on underneath the surface in a scientific or engineering sense. And Don Stokes popularized the notion of Pasteur's quadrant, which is an area of R&D where both are being done at the same time. So Pasteur came up with the germ theory of disease, but he also applied it in practice and saved a lot of lives in doing so. So Arpa-E, in my conception, is squarely in that quadrant. It's both searching for fundamental knowledge, but it's also thinking about what that knowledge is going to be used for in society and trying to bridge that famous valley of death. Okay, so the Academy's report provides a really thorough description of how Arpa-E works, and we just provide a shorter description here. It was originated by an earlier Academy's report in 2005. The idea was to model an agency in the energy area like DARPA in defense. So DARPA famously brought the defense sector stealth technology, GPS, the internet, so it's been a breakthrough agency. And that panel thought that maybe that model could be applied in energy as well. So that was put in law in 2007 in the Energy Act, and it was first funded in 2009. And it's been running for the last several years at roughly $300 million a year. Just to put that in context, the Office of Science, another agency within DOE, gets about $5 billion a year. The applied energy offices in DOE, which are ERE, energy efficiency and renewables, nuclear, electricity, and fossil, roughly get about $4 billion a year. So this is a relatively small investment when you think about the scale of DOE and our investments in energy R&D. So it got going in 2009, which is long enough to see some results, but not really long enough to judge its full impact, because as we know, energy innovation can take quite a long time. It operates in a unique way from DOE's perspective. As I said, it's modeled on DARPA, but DOE hasn't really had an agency that works like this. It brings in people from outside to serve as program directors. They may come from industry, they may come from academia, but they're there for a limited period of time to carry out a specific program. And then it gives them the authority to develop and fund such a program and their goal is to explore what they call white spaces. So these are areas of science and technology where there's a big opportunity and nobody is really working on it. So they spend time developing this program, making sure that they understand what DOE is already doing, what the private sector is doing, and what the opportunity is. And then they fund people who are working in this area. They bring together a community. And in addition, as a faculty member, I hate it when people come and manage my grants, but that's what they do. They go out and they work with their awardees to try to keep them on track, keeping them in touch with their milestones, and if necessary, shutting them down. So that's active management of their portfolio. This slide is a little bit hard to read because it was copied over, but this is from an Arpa-E document, and it's about the questions that have to be answered before a program is authorized. So it includes technical issues, right? What are the technical issues that have to be solved? But it also includes how is the knowledge going to be translated into practice? What's the impact going to be? So it's got that pasteur quality, right? Both fundamental knowledge and use orientation. And that's, again, the key quality of this agency. So now I'm going to start my Mike Carney imitation. So Mike collected the data and did the data analysis, and it was a full partner in the paper. So his work is assessing the performance. So as I mentioned, the agency's been around since 2009. That's when it first started funding R&D. I guess the first projects probably ended a couple of years later. So we have a 5 or 6 year track record to look at. Certainly not long enough to transform the U.S.'s energy situation, but enough to think about whether it's producing outputs that might lead us to expect that those goals will ultimately be influenced. So we're going to look at several areas of Arpa-E's performance using data, partially that was gathered as a part of the Academies study when Mike was working with them, and then partly new data that we've put together for this paper. So the first question that Mike looks at, and here he's working with Anna Goldstein, another consultant on the Academies project who's currently at Harvard. Did the program directors use their discretion to fund projects? So, for instance, at NIH, they have something called the pay line. You send all the proposals out. They get scored by peer reviewers. The proposals are ranked in order of their scores, and then if you have enough funding to fund 20% of the proposals, that's where the pay line is. So what Mike did in this work is look at the peer review scores of the Arpa-E proposals in a particular program, and show that a lot of projects that they funded would not have made it if you used that straight peer review approach. And then also projects that would have been funded by peer review were not funded. So the green dots here are projects that would have been funded in either approach, and the purple dots here are projects that would not have been funded under peer review but were funded by Arpa-E. So you can see the pay line there would have been just above 3.5 on that 5-point scale. So what his paper shows is that the program directors do use their discretion, and they take greater risks. If you think that peer review is kind of conservative, it tends to reward people who are already established, project ideas that are relatively well known. So it results in this pool of high-risk projects, and then, as we mentioned, they worked actively with their awardees to try to make sure that they're keeping on task. So then what do these projects produce? They did a paper in which they compared the output of Arpa-E projects with 2 other parts of DOE, the Office of Science, which is sort of the basic research arm of DOE, and EERE, the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Applied Energy Office. So that's a much more use-oriented part of DOE. And they showed that Arpa-E is performing pretty well in comparison to either, but then if we think about the intersection of those two, right, the Pasteur's quadrant really showing that it performs in both realms together. So in terms of academic publications, so that would be the realm of the Office of Science, the peer review world, that the projects funded by Arpa-E were equally likely to produce a publication as Office of Science projects. And this is controlling for a lot of other variables, the size of the project, the duration of the project, and so on. Compared to the EERE, the more applied part of DOE, the Arpa-E projects were equally likely to produce a patent, and also that these patents were more likely to be cited later, so probably more useful to innovators than the EERE patents. And then the interesting intersection, the last bullet, shows that they were 5 times more likely than either of those other programs to produce a patent and a publication, right? So crossing that valley, not just to produce something that's accepted by your peers in publication form, but also a patent that's accepted by the Patent Office as an invention. So that's a pretty big impact, and as his last bullet point shows, the idea is that Arpa-E is both able to expand the boundaries of the scientific field, but also serve as a conduit for impactful applied research. So that's one set of results, looking at kind of those immediate outputs of publication and patents. Just to put a face to the story, Hongkai Zhou, who goes by the name of Dr. Zhou, I found out, is a chemist at Texas A&M, and Anna Goldstein, who has all the data, pointed out that he is the citation champ of Arpa-E. So he received 2 awards. He works with these unique kinds of chemicals that are able to kind of tailor them, as I understand it, to bond with other molecules. And so he received 1 grant on carbon capture, another grant on natural gas, so methane, developing these metal organic frameworks to bond with those 2 substances. Those 2 awards were specifically mentioned in 53 papers. I would love to have 53 papers in my career, so I admire this output, and those papers garnered 4,000 citations. And as all of you may know, the modal number of citations that a paper gets is 0. So 95% of all papers get 0 citations, so this is a pretty impressive record. And then in addition, he's spun off a firm which has now raised a couple $1 million in startup funding. So he's our example of what Arpa-E can do in this sort of realm of publication and papers. Another area that we wanted to look at is commercialization. So these data come straight from the Arpa-E website. Arpa-E projects have led to the formation of 56 companies. Those 56 companies have now raised more than $1.8 billion in follow-on private funding, and 14 of them have products on the market. And so where we did some original work in this study was to look at what does that mean in the context of the broader clean energy investment sector. And this is what we found. So, So first, there was a boom and bust in venture funding of clean tech. So they use the term clean tech. It's a pretty broad metric of investments across a landscape of different subsectors. But this is everything aggregated. And you can see there was a peak in the late 2000s and then a huge drop off. So right around the time that Arpa-E was getting started, there was a bust in venture investing in clean tech. So that's the overall context where we need to think of Arpa-E's impact. Then more specifically, just looking at early stage, so seed, Series A, Series B, venture rounds, and breaking up the investment focus into hardware and software. You can see again this boom and bust, but also more recently the rise of software-related energy companies. I should say energy-related software companies. And we know that venture capital is very well suited for software investments because the return is quicker and the investment is smaller. And the real gap is in hardware, where you need a long runway and a lot of capital, and venture capital is just not that well suited to this purpose. So this is the context where Arpa-E is entering into. And so the analysis that we did looked at all of those companies, and then we identified those that had Arpa-E funding, and how did they perform relative to the rest of the field. So that's the burden of this analysis, and we tried to control for various things that might affect it. And what these numbers show is that the Arpa-E companies outperform their peers in receiving funding from private equity investors. So the first column, and these coefficients are a little confusing to interpret, and I'm going to rely on Mike, and if anybody has questions, we will direct them to Mike. But the first column, in terms of how much money do Arpa-E funded firms get relative to their peers, it's roughly 75% more, so that's what the 0.5 coefficient shows. The dependent variable here is a logged level of investment. So that's why it's a little difficult to interpret the coefficient. So, but again, roughly 75% more on average than a non-Arpa-E awardee. Then the last three columns look at the probability that an Arpa-E awardee would be in the top 50%, the top 10% of the funding distribution of the private equity investments. And the last column looks at whether they were able to receive government contracts like DoD contracts for follow-on support, which is another way that Arpa-E companies can continue their development. And what these coefficients mean for Model 2, so what is the likelihood that an Arpa-E awardee would wind up in the top half of the fundraising distribution? That means it's roughly twice as likely. So that 0.7 means roughly twice as likely to wind up in the top half. I think the more impressive thing is to wind up in the top 10%. It's about 5 times as likely. And the way venture capital works and a lot of investments in technology in general, almost all the money is made in the top 10 or 20%. So what we really want to do is produce candidates for that high end. Most investments in startups lose money, but a few are big winners. And Arpa-E is producing companies that are seen by the market as promising in that regard. So I think that's the biggest takeaway for me from the paper. 5 times more likely to be in the top 10% of the distribution. And then they're also roughly 3 times as likely as other clean tech companies to get follow-on funding from other government agencies, whether it's the Department of Defense or some other agency. So I think that's the big message. The way we interpret this is that Arpa-E is helping companies mature their technology to the point where private investors really want to get into them. They're helping candidates cross that valley of death, if you want to call it that. So when they first get their money, they're really not necessarily attractive to private investors, maybe investors that are huge risk takers but may not have a lot of money to put on the table. And then when they have worked through their Arpa-E project, they're much more promising. They're able to receive larger amounts and are perceived by the market as promising opportunities. And I think that's a big gap in our system of energy innovation, and Arpa-E is helping to fill the gap. So that's the main message of the paper. Recommendations. So I described a little bit about how Arpa-E works. Occasionally there are suggestions that maybe it needs to be reined in, it needs to be brought under the DOE headquarters umbrella more tightly. We think that would be a mistake. It's established a culture that's kind of unique, and it's important to maintain that and protect its autonomy. Second, we would like to see Arpa-E's budget expand. The original Academies report proposed $1 billion a year. As I mentioned, it gets roughly $300 million a year. So we suggested that original proposal should be reinstated. Others, and Brad Townsend from the American Energy Innovation Council is here, have also endorsed that kind of a scale for the budget. May not be realistic at the moment, but certainly something we should keep as an aspirational goal. Reauthorize Rpe, so there's currently a bill developing support in Congress for reauthorization. It's a bipartisan bill. Rpe has had good bipartisan support, and it's important to sustain it in that way. It would be nice if Rpe had a stable source of funding. So one of the challenges in R&D funding is ups and downs are a problem, right? If you hire grad students one year and then you have to lay them off next year, it's hard for them to get an education. So having some kind of a trust fund to stabilize the budget would really be terrific. And then the last, and again here drawing especially on the Academies report, is the idea that Arpa-E's practices might be adopted by other parts of DOE. Now, we're not saying we should remake DOE in Arpa-E's image. Arpa-E is solving a particular problem. Office of Science has a different mission. But there are practices such as the way programs are developed, the interaction with the community, perhaps some of the active management approaches that might be usefully adopted. And with that, I will turn it over to my co-panelists up here. I want to again thank Mike for his work on this and congratulate him. And we're going to ask for a few minutes of comments from each of the panelists. And as I said, we may have some crosstalk. And then we'll open it up for questions. And again, the hashtag is ITIF Clean Energy if you have questions. So thank you very much. All right, so first up is Tom Stepien. You wanted to have the main slide. So Tom is CEO of Primus Power, a energy storage company in the Bay Area, which did receive some RFPs.
We did indeed. Good morning, Tom Stepien, Primus Power. Thank you for including me. Primus is one of those 14 companies that is shipping products today, and I'd love the opportunity to briefly tell you our story. We got rolling around early 2009. Some of us remember that was a dark time here in this country, maybe around the world. You could argue whether that was a good time to start a company or a bad time to start a company, but we did it. We were about a year or so, maybe a year and a half into our life, and we had an initial battery up and running. Primus is an energy storage company. We have a stationary battery. It's a liquid battery, a flow battery, and this is something that you'd find at a substation, at a wind farm, at a solar farm, and it helps integrate renewable energy. Storage is the missing grail, the holy grail, the missing link in the energy electricity delivery equation. We were about a year and a half into our life, and we realized at that time that we probably had a Me Too product. And Me Too products that don't have a lot of differentiation, of course, tend to die quick deaths. There are some of those 80% of the companies that David mentioned that don't get on to be a successful company. We had some ideas, as all smart companies have, about maybe we can tweak a couple things. And maybe instead of using a graphite electrode in our battery, we can use a metal electrode. But a metal electrode has to be coated with a catalyst. Surprisingly, I love your name there of the title of this. And we put a concept paper into Arpa-E. A couple months later, sure enough, we received $2 million over 8 quarters. It was a 2-year grant. And what that helped us do is really pivot away from a Me Too product to what now is today a highly differentiated, highly patented core part of our technology. We ship a titanium electrode today. It is coated with these catalysts that Arpa-E's fingerprints are all over. I mention that because it was a really important injection of capital as well as an injection of intellectual property into the company. Right? So the program director aspect that David mentioned was really important. Our program director not just oversaw us, and we loved him, we hated him, like you might a thesis advisor, right? Keeps you honest, but there's huge respect for this individual and his team. But he also helped us connect the dots to other national laboratories. NREL is doing great stuff. The guys down at Oak Ridge helped us with some of the formulations of the catalyst. So he helped connect the dots within the DOE universe, which, again, for us, a small company, at that point in time, 10 or 12 guys in Hayward, California, in the Bay Area, was incredibly helpful. And, of course, the money helped, too. So if you fast forward from 2009, 2010 to today, we have 50 people in a couple different countries. We're shipping our battery systems up and down California. We have just announced the other day that we have a system in Washington State at a utility. We're shipping to South Africa. The South Africa grid is very challenged, and there's a lot of pain there, and that's a great export for us. We're shipping to China. We're shipping to Kazakhstan. We're shipping to Europe. So a small company that at the right point in time received this intellectual and capital infusion has since raised $90 million. We have an additional 20 in grants from other parts of the DOE, the DOD, Bonneville Power. We just got a $800,000 grant from the U.S. Trade and Development Agency to help us take our product outside of this country. Exports are good, right? We have 40 granted patents by 11 different countries. That $90 additional million of equity investment came also, coincidentally, from 11 different countries. So we are well on our way. We'd love to come back at some point in time and ideally be in that top 10%. We have, of course, a huge amount of things to do. But if there was one thing that I would leave you with about Arpa-E, it's reinvest. Primus is a living, breathing proof that groups like Arpa-E and the way that this is constructed can absolutely be a catalyst and be an amplifier of energy investment and success. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Lou, you want to share some thoughts?
Sure. Is this, am I audible?
You sure are.
Okay. I scribbled a few notes to respond to some of the things that were raised. And by the way, the paper was, I think, a helpful addition to the activity. At the committee, when we were reviewing Arpa-E, there were a number of things that that we were very clearly aware of. One was that there were a number of political agendas, and that we were very careful to try not to get too far into politics. So some of the things in the paper would be things that were outside what the committee would have been willing to comment on, things like budget. What I don't think I can overemphasize is that the committee that did the review was essentially convened based on wording in the enabling legislation for Arpa-E, and it was a very diverse group which did not have trouble arguing among ourselves. We had a lot of disagreement and a lot of very active discussion, and that the final report is a consensus report from a bunch of very strong-willed, opinionated, other than myself, extremely experienced and knowledgeable folks. I'm fine too, but it was an extraordinary committee. I was quite honored to be part of it. And so the strong comments that really came out were, just to reiterate, I think, the timing for transforming an economy, especially related to energy activities, is on the scale of decades, and so 5, 6, 8 years after inception, measuring actual transformation is unreasonable. That what one could reasonably look to do was to see if the Arpa-E team was on a path to do what they'd been charged to do. And some of the key issues that were highlighted both in the committee report and I think echoed in the paper were around a culture of risk-taking, the establishment of autonomy, the sort of rebellion against very standard score-based award granting, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, and that the activity associated with early proxies and interviews and what the community response was suggests that while we can't prove that Arpa-E is a success, the absence of those indicators would indicate a failure, and that there's strong evidence to say that Arpa-E is on the right path and doing the right sort of thing. So let me stop that sort of quick review for a moment. One of the things that got pointed out was in the paper the idea that peer review is good news, bad news in terms of how one approves grants. Should be noted, I know it's stated both in the paper and the other report. There is peer review associated with the Arpa-E process. There's a significant amount of gathering of information from the community of researchers. What is hinted, but not actually Arpa-E, is that the scoring of the peer reviewers is not by itself what determines the award. And there's a discussion, active discussion in a lot of granting organizations about what one should do. And it has a lot to do with the idea of risk and reward and of equity. One of the suggestions that has been positive, and this was not explicitly done at Arpa-E, but this I think is conceptually helpful, is if there's a big disagreement among the experts, if some people think it's an awful idea and some people think it's a good idea, that almost defines it as interesting, better than that it has a high average score. So the concept of peer review is not in and of itself bad. It's really how does one integrate that? How does one understand it? The concept of white space, I think I want to comment on. There's a great deal of argument about what white space means, but it has some of the, when you know it, the simple fact that nobody's active in something does not make it an interesting white space to go into. what I think the Arpa-E teams have done actually a quite nice job of articulating and then doing is what makes a white space interesting to go into is that there's a paucity of activity. There's something that would be widely believed to be of interest, but there's some sort of barrier to people pursuing it. It's not a field where if you publish papers on it, you'll get tenure. It's not a field that's being actively invested by the big players in this space, or it crosses boundaries between expertise. There's not an obvious home for it. These are the sorts of white spaces that people pursue. So it's not simply of activity that selects it. And I think that this fits nicely into the concept of a roadmap. In the last many decades of technology development, as technical problems have become ever more complex, there's a tendency to do roadmapping, to get the royal smart people together for regular meetings and talk about what is the state of the technology today, what are we learning how to do, and what will the state of technology be in the future. And the royal smart people all sort of agree what would be the safe, sensible steps to take and how fast can you go and what should you allocate. And road mapping is in and of itself a way to try and allocate resources efficiently, and it is somewhat inherently risk averse. If you are all in a large group depending on individual contributions to road mapping, and someone falls down, the whole enterprise will fail. And what Arpa-E really, I think, most clearly can do and was intended to do is, as a complement to the overall science activities that go on both in the private and the public sector, taking bigger risks than smart people on roadmaps would take to change everybody's understanding of what's possible and practical is really the function of these grants. And so while Arpa-E is really quite small, and you could easily argue it could be significantly larger without running out of good targets, there's no intention that it should be the whole enterprise. It's dessert. It's not the whole meal. And what I think, even in the Primus example you just described is a microcosm, a description of you could go down the roadmap and try and improve the carbon electrodes, or you could take a leap, go to a different materials paradigm, and see if you can get onto a different performance curve, a different learning curve. Whether or not that turns out to be what's necessary for economic success for a single company or for transforming the economy is far more complicated, and there's many externalities. But this idea of taking risks off roadmap is really what Arpa-E was intended to do. I think it was mentioned very briefly earlier, but venture is somewhat poorly coupled to green energy investment. I've been saying this for quite a long time. Sort of a voice in the wilderness early on when I would say that and the clean tech moves were going. Later on, I think a lot of people understand the issue fundamentally has to do with discount rate. If you imagine the venture fund, and I apologize if everybody's very familiar with it, imagine a venture fund is promising to their institutional investors that they're going to return 20% IRR, and they're going to invest in a dozen projects, and 10 of which are going to fail abjectly. That means the successful ones have not just being successful, but they need to be enormous, and enormously successful, so that the average IRRs, internal rate of return, will be in the 20s. If people are looking at these things having 30 to 40% discount rate kind of growth, if you understand what it takes to get a permit to do something with the utility, it's just not, the timescales are not compatible. Things that are completely outside the control of the business will delay you by a year, 18 months, and that can essentially wipe out the economics. So the idea that private industry would just start down this path, investing in venture funds, or that companies that are making good margins on technology as rational actors would cannibalize their own work by taking enormous risks, doesn't make sense. Having worked inside General Electric, actually in charge of disruptive technologies, I can say we would never do that. They would watch and wait and have deep pockets to respond. So taking these kinds of risks is really not a private function. And I think that the argument was that because of the road mapping and the peer review and the sort of very steady discipline process associated with the bulk of government research, there was this gap that Arpa-E filled. And I think that is borne out in the fact. I don't want to go too long. How much time? I've got a couple more comments, but I don't want to go too long.
Or just a minute or two, if you don't mind.
So I think that one should be extremely cautious of proxies for early success. Counting papers and counting patents can reflect much more about the culture of the organization, whether it likes to write papers or whether it likes to write patents or whether it views those things as damaging its competitiveness. And so, while I think there's really very positive indications from these early proxies of paper and patent counting and even follow-on investment for early-stage companies, there's two things that I think are important to keep in mind. One is they can be deeply misleading, and the other is that in many ways the early methods are not relevant to what the real goal is, because the real goal is fundamentally shattering the paradigms that we're working on, and the timescale for that, if you look back at all of the major innovations that made the modern world, are very, very long. So, I worked with Anna a little bit, on the committee, and I think that the work is excellent in terms of these proxies, but just being aware, we don't want to see Arpa-E drive their behavior towards driving those metrics, because they really are just proxies and they can be misleading. So just to wrap quickly then, I think what we've gotten here is created inside a very stultified government, a somewhat dynamic organization with a creative set of strategies and a culture of risk-taking that is consistent with complementing the overall sort of roadmap, cautious, peer-reviewed approaches. But the real success of this is going to be borne out over longer timescales, and we're going to see it in terms of the creating of communities of workers and businesses doing things differently than we had predicted they would do a few years ago. Let me stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Lou. So the last panelist is Drew Bond, who, as I mentioned, is with the American Council on Capital Formation and also President and CEO of Powerfield Energy.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. First, I want to thank ITIF for having me, and congratulations, David and Michael, for a great paper. It's actually well timed, and depending on how you count the birth date of Arpa-E, it's somewhere around the 10-year anniversary. So I think we need to have that party at some point. Second, I want to thank the American Council for Capital Formation and our investors for supporting our work and the bipartisan way in which we're able to pursue and promote free market-oriented solutions to public policy challenges, and particularly the need for accelerating energy innovation in America. My perspective on Arpa-E comes primarily from two places, partly from its earliest days when I was at the Department of Energy, and partly from being a clean energy entrepreneur, having lived in the so-called Valley of Death. When Arpa-E was first authorized in 2007 as a part of the Competes Act, I was serving at the Department of Energy within the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. As a senior advisor for the technology commercialization, I was appointed by President George W. Bush to help spur the transfer of energy efficiency and renewable energy technologies from the labs to the market. Our role was to help those technologies bridge the valley of death between when technology R&D occurs and when it becomes commercialized. We were a nimble team of just 3 people, Brad Barton, Michael Bruce, and myself, working across the technology silos in EERE to connect the dots between taxpayer investments and R&D and private industry and capital. Among the many initiatives we piloted were the Entrepreneur in Residence programs at the National Labs, the Technology Commercialization Fund, the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, Greening the National Parks, and several technology showcases, events for investors to interact with EERE, the programs and the research being conducted at DOE. It was a blast. After Arpa-E was first authorized and anticipation of being funded, our team was asked to join in the earliest meetings at DOE to begin sketching out just how to stand up Arpa-E once it was funded. I still remember the first meeting that was held in the Undersecretary of Science's conference room. Little did I know what Arpa-E would become. Knowing that Arpa-E was fashioned after DARPA, one of the first things that my colleague Michael Bruce and I did in our research to better understand the structure of Arpa-E was to go and meet with the then director of DARPA, Tony Tether. That was an eye-opening meeting in many ways. For one, DARPA, like Arpa-E today, has some distinctive operating procedures, as the ITIF paper notes. The one that stood out to me can be found right on the ID badge of every DARPA and now Arpa-E employee. It's their expiration date. Every DARPA employee knows when their last day at DARPA will be from the first day they start their job. They only have 3 years to serve and have an impact, after which they must go back to the private sector or some other public service role. This is so simple, but so powerful. It sets an expectation of urgency, which is critical for generating momentum with any early stage technology development. It creates a culture that focuses on results, not retirement, on taking risk, not resisting it, and ultimately the metric of success becomes outcomes, not outlays. To be clear, I say this not as a criticism to the many hardworking civil servants at DOE, but more as a criticism to the structure of DOE that was designed in a totally different era when energy was scarce and the Cold War was still cold. Another thing that stood out to me about DARPA was its high caliber of talent. Again, not a knock on the good people at DOE, but it's just a reality that you tend to attract a different kind of talent to a position that is in the business of taking risks and is empowered to make decisions and is accountable for those decisions. Along those lines, one of the best things that Secretary Chu did at the time was to hire Dave Danielson to help stand up the agency, and then Arun Majumdar to be its first director. I knew and worked with both of them when Dave was a VC and Arun was at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Under their leadership, Arpa-E established a rigorous venture capital-like culture that became the foundation for what is now beginning to pay dividends, just as the ITIF paper notes. As a clean energy entrepreneur, I understand all too well the challenges that clean energy innovations face as inventors and entrepreneurs seek to move from an idea to an innovation to having a product in the market. So a few observations about David and Michael's paper that stand out to me. First, at the risk of challenging an economist, and I am not one.
I'm not an economist.
Well, he plays a good one. I might take small issue with the statement that markets generally don't work very well in the energy sector, and thus this being a market failure. I tend to believe that markets work pretty well when they're free to work free of regulations. However, our energy markets in the U.S. and globally are not free. They are highly regulated and in some cases even controlled by cartels. I would argue that the failure is less a market failure and more a public policy and business model failure, as has been referenced, with one lesson learned being that the venture capital model doesn't always apply. As the paper points out, VCs got their clock cleaned in the last 10 years in clean tech and have since migrated back to software, which is much less capital intensive and tends to have exit horizons that are only 3 to 5 years instead of 10 to 20. Second, as the paper points out, the number of investment deals in early stage energy dropped from 3.2 billion in 2005 down to less than $1 billion now. While to be fair, we must note that the drop was almost certainly influenced, if not precipitated, by a number of market and public policy externalities, including the Great Recession, the winding down of the Iraq War, natural gas suddenly becoming cheap and abundant in America, and investor fatigue in early stage energy. Nonetheless, the fact that early stage energy investments have not rebounded, while the market overall certainly has, tells me that there's a clear and necessary role for Arpa-E. Furthermore, the fact that funding for Arpa-E is less than a third of what we spend on DARPA seems frankly unbalanced, short-sighted, and in denial of the reality that energy fuels everything. From our national security, economic prosperity, education, and healthcare, everything we do requires energy. We should be accelerating our investments in energy R&D and Arpa-E, not cutting them. Third, to me, as David and Michael's paper points out, the fact that oil and gas companies both spend around 0.25% of their revenue on R&D each year is astounding. That's a quarter for every $100 of revenue spent on energy innovation by the energy industry. I get why it is. It's because companies today must relentlessly focus on quarterly earnings for their investors. And thus, R&D is viewed more as a luxury than a necessity. That is exactly why Arpa-E is needed. Fourth, lastly, and fundamentally, I go back to the basics by asking, what is the mission of Arpa-E? And do we believe in that mission? Arpa-E's mission is to produce technologies that reduce imported energy, reduce emissions, improve energy efficiency, and support the U.S. leadership in energy technology. If this is a mission that we as the United States of America believe in, and I think it is, then we as a nation should fund it. If, on the other hand, we're stuck in petty arguments about picking winners and losers while our competition, namely countries like China, are investing heavily and strategically in their own energy innovation economies, then the only loser will be us. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew. So I guess I have a question for each of the panelists, and then we'll open it up. So, Tom, let me start with you. Could you talk just a little bit more about the program director role in connecting to resources? Because I think that may be something that wasn't emphasized in the paper, but having your personal experience is really crucial, and the kind of resources you were able to access.
Sure. So we knew about these national labs, right? It's all very findable. But when you have these quarterly meetings with the program director, and they're really good about coming to your place, seeing what you have. You said you were going to do this 13 weeks ago. How are you doing? What happened? I mean, that rigor was very good. And in some of that problem solving, the pointers were, well, go look at, look at Oak Ridge. What are they doing in terms of some of the catalyst? Maybe you want to take your system to this beautiful facility they built in Golden, Colorado, which is the energy systems integration facility. Maybe you want to take your system there before it actually goes to your first alpha customer. So we would not have thought of those on our own. But because our program director, and I bet most program directors, are in this ecosystem where they know the folks at each of those labs, they understand the capability, they are living and walking in our moccasins, so they feel our pain. They were able to, in a very cooperative way, help us direct to the right people inside of those labs. And it was great because in those specific instances, we got really good input. We are better because we took our system to NREL. We found some problems there, but it's better to find them in the lab than it is at the customer site. So they opened our eyes. Our program director did too. What is really, I have a perspective here. I worked outside the U.S. for 6 months in a national laboratory in another country. I visited 30 some odd countries, mostly in very geeky engineering ways. We have just huge national treasures in these national labs, and we would not have found them or wouldn't appreciate them as much without our program director.
Thanks. And did the ARPA-E investment send a signal to follow-on investors? I mean, some people read this as a quality signal for the investment.
Totally, yeah. I mean, it shows, it gives us some credibility, right? Because there is a pretty rigorous process in this. We applied to an Arpa-E grant previously, and we did not get it when the very first round. This was the second or third round that we got. And then when we were able to take that, it gave additional B round in our case and C round investors confidence that, hey, maybe these guys really do have something. Maybe this promise story is okay. So absolutely, that is that vetting that occurred and successful completion of the project was very helpful.
Thanks very much. So for Lou, and I guess, and maybe Tom may have this, Lou and Drew, what is the current investment environment? So there's obviously a lot of uncertainty about energy markets going forward, energy policy going forward, and how is this early stage, especially investment market at the moment, and maybe looking forward as far as your crystal ball allows?
So I can give some perspective on being in the throes of trying to raise money, and maybe Lou can give a broader perspective. But for Powerfield Energy, we're a solar hardware company dramatically seeking to simplify the installation of solar. And as simple as the product is, as revolutionary as the product is, the challenge is always investors want to see hardware having been in the field for a year or more, at which point then the bank signs off and checks the box that it's bankable. So that is the valley of death. You have a great idea, you even have a prototype, you even start to have some interesting customer traction, and investors want to see it operating in the field for a year or more. And so raising money is very challenging, particularly for an early stage company, because the other fact is that most of the time venture capitalists gravitate towards that sort of $5 to $10+ million investment. So when you're an early stage company, you have a low valuation. If you have a low valuation, if you try to raise $5 or $10 million from somebody, you give up all your company, and you don't want to do that, right? So being able to raise just enough money to get you past that valley of death, but not so much that you've given up all of your company, is really hard. So raising, I've been told again and again and again, you guys just aren't raising enough money. And so that's a real challenge, which is where a place like Arpa-E can help, because they come in with non-dilutive capital, help you get past that valley of death, so that when you're ready to raise, quote, enough money from the VCs to get their attention, that you don't have to give up all your company.
Thanks. Lou, what are your thoughts on the investment situation at the moment?
Yeah, so a couple thoughts. One's just an anecdote. Sorry for the echo. I was at a venture competition a couple of weeks ago, and someone said, well, I just don't see VC getting any money into new battery chemistry ever again. And 8 other people in the room in the investment community nodded vigorously or clapped or laughed. There seemed to be consensus that VCs were done investing in battery chemistry. Now that's a snapshot, and I'm sure that that's not permanent, but I think that what we're seeing is an extreme reluctance for early stage investment in energy technologies, partially due to some of the players got hurt, partially due to, I think, some growing up of people and understanding what the timescales are. And what's happening, sort of the flip side of that, is enormous amounts of money are flowing into the deployment of technologies that are effectively mature. And how we manage to get utility scale solar into the category of mature so that people are writing billion-dollar checks is still a little mysterious, having lived through it for the last 20 years. I don't quite know how it happened, but it's wonderful. But the idea that early stage innovations are going to struggle to get private money, I don't think has ever been there. And a lot of the companies that I talk to, I'm encouraging them to go to China, because people will deploy more rapidly in China than in the United States. And so from the standpoint of the well-being of the U.S. economy and the concept that the U.S. would have leadership and would be an ecosystem that's driving these things, I'm really skeptical that we're doing anywhere near enough. I think that Arpa-E is helpful, but no one should get confused and think that is.
Great, thanks. So I'm just going to make a couple of remarks while hopefully the audience thinks of their questions, and we'll open it up as well. If you're online, again, the hashtag is ITIF Clean Energy if you have questions or comments. So I just wanted to make a couple of clarifying remarks. So first, just reflecting Lou's point, energy storage is a major area that Arpa-E has invested in, and we have a short vignette of that here. And it's going to continue, as I understand it. I know there's a workshop coming up on long-duration storage that Arpa-E is considering. So, so I think that's an important field. Many people see it as the unlocking of renewables and other and efficiency and other resources that are not being tapped, although we have the technologies there. So it's complementary to a lot of things that will help decarbonize the energy system. So that's a major area that Arpa-E has been involved in and continues to stay involved in. I wanted to make clear that we're not attacking DOE, and I appreciate Drew's defense of his former colleagues over there. Obviously, there are many ways that DOE could be reformed, but Arpa-E is a complementary effort. It's meant to help make more of resources that we're investing already in other parts of DOE and other government investments. And then last, just to echo Lou's remark and clarify, the 2017 Academies Committee did not make any recommendation about the budget. The $1 billion mark comes from the 2005, the original Arpa-E recommendation from the Academies. So, so I want to make sure that that recommendation isn't attributed to the 2017 panel, which was tasked with assessing Arpa-E's performance. Great. So let me see if there are questions here. If you don't mind, state your affiliation and fire away. So, Dorothy, I know, so I'll start with you.
Thank you. Dorothy Robine, formerly with DOD in the Obama administration. Two comments. The first one, to follow up on your fifth recommendation about trying to extend the Arpa-E culture to other parts of DOE. When I was in the Pentagon overseeing military bases, I did, and working with Roland Rizzer, who was running the EERE building R&D program, I did a little informal comparison of where Arpa-E's money was going and where Roland's money was going. And it was pretty dramatic. In the case of Arpa-E, it was almost all going to industry, to firms. I mean, it's so obvious that nobody's even pointed that out. For the building R&D program, it was going almost entirely to labs and universities. And I think one reason you hear so much talk about technology transfer in DOE, and Drew, you were working on that, is because the money goes to a place from which it has to be transferred. If it's with the Arpa-E model, when it goes to industry, you have the agent of technology transfer right there. It's companies like Tom's that are busy commercializing it. So I think that is one of the, it's so obvious, but I think that is a dramatic success factor with Arpa-E that should be extended, maybe not to the Office of Science, but to ERE and other parts of DOE. Second comment, and I've made this comment before, I think a closer partnering with DOD would be useful in the future with Arpa-E. I think Steve Chu and Arun recognized that DOE could be a good customer. Arun came to see me his first week on the job. I think there were some practical problems to implementing that, but I think one reason that Arpa-E that DARPA has been historically so successful and that DOD is such an engine of technological innovation is that DOD is the customer. So you have supply and demand under one roof. They work hand in glove. The culture of demonstration and validation is one indication of that. So DOD can be a really excellent customer for a very sophisticated customer for Arpa-E. It's also helpful politically, but I'm really thinking of it more as a useful customer.
Thank you, Dorothy. And I would note that we have a small box as well in the paper on the role of DOD. There have been some programs that explicitly within Arpa-E have had that link. And this data is a little out of date, March 2016, 22 startup firms funded by Arpa-E, had received follow-on support from a unit within DoD. So that's a fraction of the companies, and obviously not all are necessarily good candidates for DoD, but I do think it's an important source of follow-on interest in. Tom, your company has had some DoD customers?
We have, and in fact, Miramar is a Marine base in San Diego where they filmed Top Gun years ago. I saw it when it was in a movie theater. I'm dating myself. We worked with DOE, Arpa-E, and the DoD on that project, and that's maybe an example, Dorothy, of that working together. Again, Arpa-E's fingerprints are all over what we call our Top Gun system running at Miramar.
Thank you.
Adam Siegel, Secretary of Analysis. It will be somewhat a follow-up to Secretary Robine. Very hard sort of metric, or even thinking about it. One of the things that's really impressed me about Arpa-E is the creation of communities. If we take, for example, the conference, I actually know companies that were formed because of people meeting there that never got a penny from Arpa-E. If I went to other conferences and activities, the creation of culture, both directly at the, for example, the innovation summits, but also through otherwise. So maybe talking about how one can look at Arpa-E as creating a culture of innovation in the energy world, or interactions in a community. And then second, going to Secretary Robine's sort of conversation is, okay, DARPA, DoD, Arpa-E, how do we create a culture of these sorts of across the government, DHS and otherwise, of not just that each has its own stovepipe, so to speak, but a community of organizations that are driving the innovation.
Lou, do you want to comment on the community question? I think that's something that that the academies address more fully than I did in my paper.
Yeah, so there was a lot of discussion. Apologize, man. There was a lot of discussion in the committee about this. One of the things that I think is a useful distinction is there's a convening role, which is getting folks in the same room where you can spark episodic advances, formation of companies, collaboration. And then there was the concept of community. And we definitely saw significant evidence that there was a value created from the community. We saw less evidence, not the same as saying it happening, but it wasn't happening, but less evidence of sort of long-lasting communities that have grown out of the programs or the general activity. And I think that nurturing those kind of communities is something that maybe incremental value. And at this point, before I go too far over my skis, what we discussed internally versus actually looked at, so I think I'm okay so far. One of my colleagues, Don Wall, likes to say that you don't have to be doing badly to do better. So I think what we saw was definitely evidence, to your point, that the community was creating value, and we were, I think, hopeful that there would be an opportunity for more sort of creation of workers, and that may really just be a timescale.
Thanks. And then on the question of a broader culture of innovation across the federal government, I think that's a really challenging task. I'm really encouraged by the story that Tom told about connecting up different resources which are otherwise stovepiped, and I'm also working on the manufacturing institutes, and I think they can potentially have that capability. So I was just out at Oak Ridge, and we see some of this networking going on. But and maybe Drew wants to comment that. I think it ultimately does come down to the incentives, and it's a challenging thing because we do want to have our public and private boundaries have some clarity. We don't want people enriching themselves on the public purse, but at the same time, we do want to encourage that transfer of knowledge and that interaction. And I think we're still groping our way towards those things. Our system hasn't really been developed for that function very well, and we can see some of these new initiatives like Arpa-E as experiments for how to design that. And part of it is, I think, as well, this ability to bring people in temporarily, as well as allow public employees to go off for a few years and try things out and be able to return if they don't succeed.
Yeah, I would agree, David. I think you're right. Systemically, this is a challenge because clearly collaboration across the silos benefits all the organizations. And but I mean, I can tell you from my experience, one of the most challenging things I did at DOE was actually move $500,000 from DOE to Interior for greening the national parks. So money from one federal account to another federal account, and you would have thought I was trying to steal the money. It was incredibly hard, and it gets into the weeds a little bit with the way policy and entities like OMB require the siloed money to be sort of untouched by its original intent of appropriations. But even the standing up of the Technology Commercialization Fund, which was authorized in 2005 as a part of the Energy Policy Act, it says to take 0.9% of all applied energy R&D and set up this account to work across the programs within DOE. So congressionally authorized 0.9%. I showed up in 2007. In 2008, we first tried to stand it up, and again, you would have thought we were trying to steal money. And we had to point folks in DOE, including the General Counsel's office, back to the legislation to say, A, we have the statutory authority to do this. B, it's the program's money, but ultimately it's the taxpayers' money, and the legislators and appropriators have made clear that they think there's a benefit to collaborating across the silos. So I think the more that there are events like Arpa-E's showcase, the more that there are sharing of employees across agencies. All those things help kind of promote collaboration and getting people out of the silos. So absolutely would agree, Adam.
Thanks. Other questions? Do you have anybody online? Brad.
Hi, thanks. Brad Townsend, the Bipartisan Policy Center, and also the American Energy Innovation Council. So my question is about the juxtaposition of both the data that was in the report about venture capital and also sort of, I think, well-publicized bust in VC around clean energy as well. The report that MIT did several months ago about effectively sort of past judgment that VC and energy were not a good fit. And so I'm wondering if there is something that can be extrapolated from the data that you put together in terms of Arpa-E's potential to change that. Should that give us any faith or even perhaps direction about how to think about? And that's not to say, obviously, that that energy or hard tech is going to surpass software, but I don't think we should give up on it either. And so I'm wondering what can be sort of gleaned from what was in your report. Maybe others obviously have some input on that as well.
Yeah, I'll let the investors and entrepreneurs tell the story too. My impression is that it's not that VC doesn't fit with energy overall. It's just that it needs to come in at a certain stage because the characteristics, and especially energy hardware investments. I mean, I think energy software probably will be like other software. Maybe it's more complex and the ramp is slower than an app, but nonetheless, it's not as challenging as hardware. But that you need other vehicles to mature the technology to bring it to the point where the VCs or other kinds of investors, maybe they're strategic investors or other kinds of private equity investors, can get the return that they need to satisfy their criteria. So I think it performed, the way we read the data is that it's performing this bridging function. And it may alone not be enough. I mean, maybe the DoD also has a role in this kind of maturation phase for certain kinds of technologies that suit their missions. But there has to be a public role in bridging that gap. And we won't argue over market failures. I won't take Drew on that. But these kinds of investments are not going to meet most private investors' standards. And unless we want there are some investors, and Tom mentioned foreign investors. Foreign investors are increasingly stepping in for scale up, and some of that is strategic national policy, and some of that is just that they're willing to be more patient. But I think in the U.S. system, we do not have a very good vehicle for this kind of investment with these
It's a good question, Brian, and it's a huge dilemma because it seems like it's easier to fund companies that want to have 140 characters, I guess not 280, than
We get twice as much
other,
money now at 280.
Exactly. Other companies, I mean, there's a reason it's called hardware. Hardware companies are hard. And yes, it does seem like there's better appetite overseas. I think what it does, though, there's the goodness of that tough environment, because Sandhill is dead. There are a couple of bright spots, but Sandhill is dead in terms of energy investment, is that it forces entrepreneurs to really think carefully on how you can use precious money that you are able to get. Forces you to think about the minimal viable product. What do you want to show? How do you want to show this? How can you eke out and hit these milestones so that you can get that next round? So there's goodness in that, right? That ecosystem, that feedback loop, if you will, forces you to be better. But it is tough, but there are. The world also is pretty flat, right? We have investors from 11 countries. I wouldn't have thought we would have gone that far, but that is easier than you would have thought otherwise. Just in terms of getting some of those funds and getting some of those money, hasn't been easy, but it's easier than you would have thought. Put that in perspective.
David?
David Cheney with Technology Policy International, formerly with DOE a long time ago. So, as Dorothy Robin mentioned, one of the reasons for DARPA's success is that it has a clear customer, and this was something that was, I think, discussed a lot when Arpa-E is being formed, whether the model works as well when you don't have a clear customer or more diffuse customer. So, with the experience now, how has this worked out in practice? How has it affected ARPA's operations and its success, and what does it say about using the DARPA model in other areas?
Yeah, so I'll give my impression and then maybe ask Lou to make some comments on that. I don't think it translates perfectly for exactly the reason that you mentioned, that the downstream customer is not only diffuse but changing rapidly. So when Richard Lester and I were working on our book on energy innovation, within 5 years of starting the project, the landscape had been transformed. You had shale gas, you had Fukushima. If you could predict the energy market, you shouldn't be sitting here. You should be in your chalet somewhere enjoying a nice life. So I do think it's a challenge. Now, one thing that Arpa-E does is have these tech-to-market programs, and this is something that the Academies Committee looked at, and I think that's one of the ways that they're trying to help bridge that gap. But I do think it's an inevitable difference between the two fields, and I don't think there's a perfect solution. Lou, do you have some thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the parallel with DARPA is significantly weakened by the simple fact of the giant deep-pocketed customer that DARPA has that ARPA does not have. I don't believe venture is well matched to doing these sorts of investments, and I don't think that Arpa-E graduates are necessarily far enough along, close enough to get real money that private money is going to flow in. My personal opinion is that ARPA can change the roadmap and people's understanding of the possible and do essentially those things in its mission, but the problem of follow-on and commercialization remains unsolved.
Thanks. So I think I saw one more hand. Okay, well, I think we'll just leave it there, and let me thank again Drew, Tom, and Lou for joining us today. Thank the audience, and thank ITIF, and we'd welcome comments on the paper from anyone who may have them in the future. So thank you again for coming.